You hear the stones before you see them. The first one strikes your shoulder not hard enough to break bone, but enough to send you stumbling forward against the ropes. The crowd is silent now, watching. You cannot see their faces anymore. The sun is too bright, or maybe it's the blood in your eyes. Another stone, this one, finds your ribs. You try to remember your children's names, but all you can hear is the sound of hands reaching into piles of rock. You wonder, in this final, terrible moment, if your husband is among them, if his fingers are choosing a stone right now, if he will aim for your head or your heart. Before we continue, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching this from? It amazes me that a story this old, this dark, can travel across centuries and oceans to find you right now. This is not a single moment. This is not one woman's story. What you just witnessed has happened in Babylon under Hammurabi's stone tablets, in medieval Germany along the Rhine, in Puritan Massachusetts while church bells rang, for thousands of years across every inhabited continent. When a woman was accused of adultery, the punishment was not designed merely to end her life. It was designed to erase her humanity first, to transform her from person to symbol, from wife to warning, from living being to public lesson, carved in blood and terror. These were not crimes of passion. They were state-sponsored rituals, codified in law, blessed by priests, and carried out by ordinary people who believed they were protecting civilization itself. This is the history of how love became treason and betrayal became a death sentence that only women had to pay. The earliest written evidence we have comes from the ancient city of Babylon. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi's legal code was carved into a black diorite, stele, nearly 8 feet tall, and it still exists today in the Louvre Museum in Paris. Among its 282 laws, one stands out for its cold precision. Law 129, if the wife of a man is caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. But there's a clause that reveals everything about power and gender in ancient Mesopotamia. If the husband lets his wife live, then the king shall let his servant live. The woman's fate rested entirely in her husband's hands. Her lover's fate rested in the king's, but her own agency that had already drowned. Yet drowning, scholars discovered, was considered merciful. In cities across Mesopotamia or Nippur, Lagashwan communities wanted to make an example. They turned to stones. Not because stones were more lethal, but because they required participation. One person cannot stone another to death alone. It takes a crowd, it takes time. It takes a community deciding moment by moment to keep throwing. The condemned woman would be led to the city gates at dawn. Sometimes she was stripped naked, other times left in a thin shift that would offer no protection. They would place her in a shallow pit, sometimes binding her arms, sometimes leaving them free so she could try hopelessly to shield her face. Then the elders would step forward first. This was crucial to the ritual. The men with the most authority had to throw first, legitimizing what came next. Their stones were often smaller, more symbolic than lethal. But once they had thrown, the crowd surged forward. Here's what the ancient texts don't tell you, but archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from execution sites does. Death by stoning was rarely quick. The human skull is remarkably resilient. The first dozen stones might cause bleeding, fractures, disorientation, but consciousness often remained. Some women took hours to die. The stones would shatter ribs, collapse lungs, rupture organs all, while the victim remained aware. In some cases, According to Assyrian legal commentaries discovered in the library of Ashurbanipal, executioners would deliberately avoid the head and chest at first, prolonging the spectacle to maximize its deterrent effect. But why? Why this level of cruelty for adultery, when other crimes, theft, assault, even some murders carried fines or lesser punishments? The answer lies in what a woman's body represented in ancient patriarchal societies. She was not merely a person. She was a vessel for legitimate heirs, a guarantor of property transfer, a living contract between families. When she committed adultery, she didn't just betray her husband. She contaminated the bloodline. She threw inheritance into question. She violated what these societies considered a divine order, where men's property and women were legally property must remain pure and traceable. The punishment had to be public because her crime was against the entire social structure, and it had to be participatory because everyone needed to reaffirm their commitment to that structure by destroying the woman who threatened it. Now leap forward nearly 3,000 years to medieval Germany in the 1400s. The landscape has changed. Christianity has replaced ancient Mesopotamian gods. But the obsession with punishing female sexuality that has evolved into something even more systematic in the Holy Roman Empire. Legal codes like the Saxenspiegel and later the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina of 1532 prescribed specific punishments for adulterous women. The method that emerged in southern Germany, Austria, and Switzerland was called sacking sack drowning. It was codified, routine, and performed with bureaucratic precision. Court records from Nuremberg, Augsburg, and Regensburg describe the procedure in disturbing detail, as if documenting a civic engineering project rather than a human execution. The condemned woman would be brought to the river on execution day. Officials had prepared a large sack, often made of leather or heavy cloth. Into this sack they would place stones for weight. But here's where it gets worse. In many cases, they also added live animals. Dogs were common, sometimes cats, occasionally roosters. Why? The legal scholars of the time wrote that, since the woman had behaved like a beast by betraying her husband, she should die among beasts. But there was another reason, more practical and more cruel. The struggling animals would thrash inside the sack, using up oxygen faster, making the drowning quicker but more terrifying. The woman would then be bound hands behind her back, ankles together and sewn into the sack. The sewing was methodical. They didn't want the sack to burst open and spoil the execution. Once sealed inside, she would be in complete darkness, unable to move, unable to scream in any way that could be heard, pressed against sharp stones and the claws of panicking animals. Then the sack would be carried to a boat or to the edge of a bridge. There's a moment here that eyewitness accounts mention repeatedly. Just before they throw the sack into the water, there's a pause. The executioners would hold the sack suspended over the water, letting the crowd take in the scene. Inside, the woman would feel the shift in balance, would know what was about to happen. Some accounts mention the sack moving, bulging in places as the woman fought against her bindings, or as the animals scratched at the inside of the fabric. Then they would release it. A sack full of stones, animals, and a human being doesn't float. It doesn't sink slowly, it plunges. The cold shock of the water would hit through the fabric. The immediate disorientation of not knowing which way is up. The desperate attempt to hold one's breath while bound and crushed by stones. Most drowning victims, modern forensic science tells us, lose consciousness within 2 to 3 minutes when submerged. But those minutes, when you're sewn into darkness with animals clawing at you and water filling your lungs, must have felt infinite. The body was usually left to drift downstream. Sometimes it would wash up miles away, the sack torn open by rocks or decomposition, the remains barely recognizable as human. This was intentional. The adulterous woman was not given a proper burial. She was disposed of like refuse. Her body denied the Christian rituals that would ensure her soul's rest. Even in death, the punishment continued. What's remarkably and horrifying is how authorities justified this as the merciful option for women, because burning was worse. Across Europe, particularly from the 14th through 17th centuries, fire became the preferred method for punishing women whose sexual transgressions were compounded by other accusations. A woman caught in adultery might initially face whipping or public penance. But if she had also been heard speaking against the church, or if neighbors whispered that she used herbs to prevent pregnancy, or if her lover was from a lower social class, the charges would escalate. Adultery became unchastity. Unchastity became moral corruption. Moral corruption became witchcraft, and witchcraft burned. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 and used as a handbook for witch hunters across Catholic Europe, explicitly connected female sexuality with demonic power. All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which in women is insatiable, it declared. A woman known to have committed adultery was already halfway to being labeled a witch in the minds of prosecutors. The step from one accusation to the other was frighteningly small. Town squares across France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and even parts of Italy saw these executions. They followed a ritual pattern. The announcement would be made days in advance, ensuring maximum attendance. On execution day, the woman would be paraded through the streets, sometimes on a cart, sometimes forced to walk. If she was fortunate, she wore a simple shift. If authorities wanted to maximize humiliation, she might be stripped to the waist or dressed in a garment painted with flames and demons. The stake was usually set up in the center of the square, visible from all sides. Around it, executioners would stack bundles of wood, hay, and sometimes pitch or oil-soaked cloth to make the fire burn hotter and faster. The woman would be tied to the stake with iron chains or thick rope. Before the fire was lit, a priest would approach, offering one last chance to confess her sins and repent. If she refused, it was taken as proof of her demonic nature. Then they lit the fire. Here's what most people don't realize about death by burning. It's not the flames that kill you first, it's the smoke and heat. When wood burns, it produces thick, toxic smoke filled with carbon monoxide. In some cases, this would cause unconsciousness before the flames reached the body. But this mercy was inconsistent, dependent on wind direction, wood moisture, and how the fire was built. In cases where authorities wanted to prolong suffering or where the fire was poorly constructed, the victim would remain conscious as the flames climbed up their legs, blistering skin, charring flesh, boiling subcutaneous fat. The screaming would start immediately and could last for minutes before shock and smoke inhalation finally brought unconsciousness. Some executioners, either out of genuine mercy or to end the spectacle more quickly, would secretly strangle the woman before lighting the fire, or place a small bag of gunpowder around her neck that would explode and kill her when the flames reached it. But this was unofficial and inconsistent. Many women received no such mercy. The smell of burning human flesh, sweet, greasy, unmistakable wood, hang over the town square for hours. People would remember it every time they walked through that space. That was the point. The square itself became a monument to punishment, a place where the memory of what happened to disobedient women was literally burned into the community's senses. Now across the Atlantic, it's 1642 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans who fled religious persecution in England have established their own society in the New World, built on strict biblical law. They've brought their obsessions with them, particularly their fear of female sexuality. Under the Massachusetts Body of Liberties, adultery is technically a capital crime. If any man shall commit adultery with a married or espoused wife, the adulterer and adulteress shall surely be put to death. This is taken directly from Leviticus. But the Puritans, despite their harsh reputation, rarely executed people for adultery alone. They developed something they considered more civilized: public corporal punishment combined with permanent social marking. The whipping post stood in every town center. When a woman was convicted of adultery, and conviction rates for women were dramatically higher than for men, especially if pregnancy revealed the crime, she would be sentenced to public flogging. The typical sentence was 39 lashes, a number chosen because it was one less than 40, which the Bible specified as the maximum punishment a person could endure and remain human. On Punishment Day, the woman would be stripped to the waist and tied to the post, her back exposed. The constable would use a whip made of leather strips, sometimes with small metal tips. The lashes would be delivered methodically, counting aloud so the crowd could track the progress. By the 10th lash, the back would be bleeding. By the 20th, the skin would be shredded. By the 30th, witnesses reported that you could see the muscle and bone beneath the torn flesh. But the pain was only part of the punishment. After the whipping, the woman would be placed in the pillory, wooden device that locked her head and hands in place, forcing her to stand immobile for hours while the community walked past. People would throw garbage, rotten food, even stones. They would shout insults. Sometimes they would spit on her. Children were encouraged to participate. It was considered educational, a way to teach them about sin and its consequences. And then came the branding. Not with a hot iron on the skin, though that happened in some colonies, but with cloth and thread. The woman would be required to sew a large letter A onto her clothing. This is the origin of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. But, unlike the novel, this was real and widespread. The letter had to be visible at all times, worn on the chest of every garment she owned. Some colonies specified this size at least 2 inches tall and the color usually red or scarlet, but sometimes white against dark cloth. This marking was for life. There was no expiration, no way to remove it without breaking the law and facing further punishment. The woman would wear this letter when she went to church, to market, to visit neighbors. Her children would grow up seeing it on their mother's chest. Her husband, if he chose to stay with her, would see it every day. The A transformed her into a walking reminder of sin, a permanent warning to other women about the cost of disobedience. What's particularly cruel is how these punishments claim to be about protecting the moral order. Yet they disproportionately destroyed women's lives, while often letting men off with fines or minor public penance. Court records from Salem, Boston, and Plymouth Colony showed that when both the adulteress and her male partner were identified and tried, the woman's sentence was almost always more severe. In cases where pregnancy was the evidence of adultery, the woman faced certain punishment, while the man could often deny paternity without consequence. But here's what might be the darkest truth underlying all of these punishments across all of these centuries. They worked. Not in preventing adultery. Human nature has never been subject to legal control like that. They worked in maintaining a power structure where women's bodies, women's choices, and women's very humanity were treated as public property to be policed by the state, the church, and the community of men who benefited from that arrangement. The woman in the pit in Babylon, stones shattering her bones. The woman sewn into the sack in the Rhine, drowning in darkness. The woman tied to the stake in the town square, flames consuming her. The woman at the whipping post in Massachusetts, back torn open. These were not just punishments. They were messages. They were performances of power. They were warnings written in female flesh and blood, telling every other woman what awaited those who dared to claim autonomy over their own desires, their own bodies, their own lives. And, perhaps most disturbing of all, these punishments were not carried out by monsters. They were carried out by ordinary people, neighbors, family members, fellow townspeople who genuinely believed they were upholding justice, protecting their communities, and following divine will. The executioner who threw the stones in Babylon went home to his family afterward. The officials who sewed the woman into the sack in Nuremberg received payment for their services and were considered respectable tradesmen. The constable who delivered the lashes in Boston was probably a church-going father. The crowds who watched were not sadists. They were citizens performing their civic and religious duty. That's the lesson that echoes across the centuries. These systems of cruelty didn't require evil people to function. They required only the belief that some humans, in this case, women, were less entitled to mercy, less deserving of autonomy, less fully human than others. Once that belief was established, codified, and blessed by authority, ordinary people could commit extraordinary cruelty and sleep soundly afterward. The stones have been thrown, the fires reduced to ash, and the scars on the whipping post faded, but the memory of what was done endures. Not as distant history, but as a warning of what humans justify when power, religion, and fear of female autonomy converge. A woman's body is still used as a battlefield for someone else's moral order. The methods shift, but the impulse to control remains. Lorenzo's journal, found beneath the Castello Sforzesco, reminds us that knowledge of cruelty never dies, it adapts. Speaking new languages while the world pretends the past is safely buried,